Will you pray with me? Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Why are you afraid? I know that may seem to be a presumptuous question, but I bet you can answer it. Is there anyone here who isn't afraid of something? It seems we all exist with a certain amount of baseline fear. It's part of the human condition. We worry about the big stuff: economic collapse, nuclear war, melting ice caps, terminal illness, superstorms. And then we worry about the small stuff: losing our hair, losing our minds, tense relationships, troubled kids, aging parents. Whatever our circumstances, we are almost always afraid of something. In our gospel this morning, that question of fear is front and center as we continue our sermon series on the questions of Jesus. As a community of seekers and thinkers and doubters and hopers, we know that questions are an essential part of our faith. And Jesus knew that too. He loves a good question. And he asks a lot of them, 307 to be precise, and of the 183 that are asked of him, he only answers 8, and most of them with another question. So I think it says a lot about our faith that our Bible is so much more a question book than an answer book. And I think we get into trouble when we forget that. So as I was planning this series, I had a lot of Jesus' questions to choose from. Some were deep and philosophical, and some were subtle and nuanced, and some, quite frankly, seemed ridiculously obvious, like this one. See, the disciples have pushed out to sea in this little boat, and soon they are caught up in a massive storm, and waves are crashing over the bows, and wind is tearing at the sails, and the boat is beginning to take on water, and Jesus asks the disciples, "Why are you afraid?" Really, Jesus, do you have to ask that? Why wouldn't they be afraid? Their lives are in danger. They could all die. The question I want to ask of Jesus is, why aren't you afraid? Or put another way, what do you know that we don't know? Now there's an interesting question, and we'll get to that one later. But for now, let's just stay in the boat with the disciples. The Gospels talk a lot about water and boats. Whenever Jesus seems to be ready to take his ministry to the next level, he sets out in a boat with his friends. And even though many of them are fishermen, they often seem really out of their element. In one story, they can't catch any fish. In another, Peter sinks as he tries to walk on water. And in this story, they are caught in a storm. And they are confused and overwhelmed and frightened. In many sacred stories from many traditions, water is a symbol of chaos and danger. And we see this right from the start in the book of Genesis. Water, what the writer calls the deep, is the force that God must tame before life can begin. Water is powerful and unpredictable. And if we are not careful, it can pull us under. Have you ever felt that way? Like everything you depended on was unraveling? Like you were up against forces that you couldn't control and your rickety little boat was taking on water? I know I have. What do you do in those times? How do you face those fears? The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh describes the human condition as sharing two things, what he calls original desire and original fear. He locates original fear in the primal experience of being separated from the all-encompassing warmth and safety of our mother's womb. The traumatic experience of birth with all of its new and frightening sensations leaves a mark on us. When the umbilical cord is cut, we are separated from the source of our life, which leaves us painfully vulnerable. Even as an infant, outside of the womb, we are totally dependent on our caregiver to provide for us, and without them, we would die. Our original desire to survive is inextricably linked with our original fear that we can't make it on our own. And from there, Thich Nhat Hanh says, all our other fears are born. This story of the disciples at sea embodies that original fear completely. For not only are their lives in danger, the person they have come to depend on doesn't seem to care. More upsetting than the storm itself is that Jesus is sleeping through it. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? It seems that Jesus is either clueless or callous, and neither of these options is particularly comforting. It touches a raw nerve. For both Jesus' followers and the folks who heard this story when it was written 40 years later had every reason to feel vulnerable and abandoned. You see, Mark's gospel is a wartime gospel, written when Jerusalem was being sacked by the Roman army in the year 70 CE. The temple had been completely destroyed, and with it, their entire way of life. And the Jews were sent fleeing into the diaspora, never to be the same community again. It felt like the waves were crashing over the bow, and they had every reason to be afraid and to wonder where God was in all of this chaos. Here in this story, Mark is speaking directly to his little war-torn community, and by extension, to us. There will be times when you will feel like your boat is being swamped and you will not make it, he says. And when that happens, do not be afraid. Jesus is there. Jesus will calm the storm. This kind of faith, this kind of trust is easy when the sea is glassy and the skies are clear. But it gets much harder when the water is rough. But as Jesus always reminds us, the water will always get rough. The Bible is full of stories of people in crisis, and that's because it's written by humans about humans. But it is also written by humans about God, or about our experiences of God. And at critical times across the biblical drama, apostles and angels and prophets, those voices of God break into our crises to utter 4 simple words. Do not be afraid. This phrase occurs 366 times in the scriptures, enough to cover us for every day of the year and with one to spare. It wouldn't be written so often if we didn't need to hear it so often. The world is a dangerous place, and we are fragile creatures. And yet, into all of this chaos, we are told, do not be afraid. Can we do that? Jesus tells us we can. For here's where that scary water metaphor can be a source of comfort as well. For while water can pull us under, it is also life-giving, refreshing, essential, and if we learn how to float, it can carry us to safety. And that seems to be what Jesus knows that we don't know. Jesus knows how to float. He sleeps through that storm, not because he doesn't care, but because he knows that God cares. He knows how to trust in the power of God's love that overrides any fear. The way the gospel stories are often written, it seems that Jesus had this floating ability from the start. But I don't believe that is true. Jesus' ministry didn't start until he was 30 years old, and I have to believe that he did a lot of living and doubting and questioning and struggling before then. I believed he forged his relationship with God through living into his messy humanity, not by denying it. And that means he found a way to live through his fear and find God on the other side. The true miracle in this story is not that Jesus has the power to calm the storm, but that Jesus has the faith to sleep through it. That's the miracle. And by faith, we don't mean something that we do with our minds. It's not about doctrines, or it's not an intellectual assent to correct belief. Faith is something we do with our hearts. And it's something that then translates into action. Faith is really about trust. We don't possess it, we live it. Trust liberates us to embrace life, to realize our full potential. Fear paralyzes us. It shreds our confidence in ourselves, in the world, and in our relationship with God. When you are afraid, it is impossible to trust. And that's what happens to the disciples here. The issue is not that they are afraid of the storm. That is common sense. That is the original desire to survive kicking in. The issue is that their fear overrides their trust in Jesus' presence. They don't say to him, "Teacher, we need your help." They say, "Teacher, don't you care that we are dying?" That's not a trusting question. It's a fear-based accusation. And so in the face of their fears, Jesus asks them about their faith. Having faith, learning to trust, it's not a magic bullet. It doesn't remove the storms. It will not lead to lives of endless safety and peace. We just have to look at Jesus' own life to see that. But learning to trust that God is with us when the storms hit, finding peace in the chaos, that's the promise of faith. And it's a promise that it can take a lifetime to live into, which is okay. Because here's the real good news of this story. We don't have to have that perfect faith already for the storm to calm. Keep in mind that Jesus assuages the disciples' fears even when they don't trust him. God doesn't wait until they or we get it right. She responds to their fears and our fears, even when we are at our worst. And in that response, we are transformed into folks who can look at the world not in fear, but in awe, who come to a new awareness as to who Jesus is and look at him not with skepticism, but with trust. And I believe that is the invitation of this story today. We are invited to bring all of our fears and all of our anxieties to God as best we can, and to trust that he will hold us in a love that will never let us go. What Jesus knew, sleeping peacefully in that boat while the storm raged around him, is that our umbilical cord with God is never cut. While we may have been separated from our mothers at birth, we are never separated from God. No matter what our lives bring, there is no fear, no danger, no crisis, no storm that is larger or more powerful than God's love for us. When the winds whip up and the waves get high, we need not fear. Jesus is right in that boat with us. And that is all we'll ever need. Thanks be to God. Amen.